Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event on CCS and the APAC region, and welcome also to our guests who are joining us online, our virtual guests. So great that you can be here with us today. We've got a great panel lined up here, and we're going to try and sort of go through a little bit of a journey and a discussion looking at different aspects of CCS, technological carbon removals, and try and get a lay of the land through a mixture of views from standard setters, financiers, lawyers, and tech vendors. So my name is Paul Zakor. I've been working in the CCS field for quite a long time, probably best part of the last 20 years, seen the ups and downs of it, and I'm going to try and encapsulate some of that in the next 5-10 minutes just to set the scene, and then we'll go into a bit of a panel discussion. So just bring up the slides, please. So I work for a company called Carbon Counts. We're a very small consultancy, been in business for about 14 years, and one of our areas we do quite a bit of work is CCS and technological carbon removals. Just to set the scene, carbon geostorage is really essential to achieving net zero by 2050. Here's a couple of graphs from the International Energy Agency. On the left-hand side is their net zero emissions trajectory. Here we see over 7 gigatons of CO2 being captured and stored each year by 2050 from a wide variety of activities. So not just fossil fuel power generation, but all kinds of novel applications, including bioethanol production and hydrogen production. And also what you see on the right is from the ETP from the year earlier from IEA, but that one gives you the sort of regional spread, and you can see that carbon geostorage, or CCS, and technological removals is relevant for every region of the world. So it's not just a OECD country problem, but it's a global kind of application. What we see here is the IPCC 6th assessment report, and we see the scale of carbon removals that are needed to reach net zero by 2050 in this area here under the line. And when you dig into the data, you see the numbers are around about sort of 2 to 3 gigatons of geological carbon being stored in 2050 from bioenergy and from direct air capture. So the numbers are sort of eye-wateringly large. If we actually think where we are today, we're currently injecting around 40 million tons of CO2, 43 million tons in 2022. So, we've got to scale this industry by an order of magnitude and more. So that's quite a significant challenge to do in the next 28 years. If we actually look at the history of this, a lot of people don't know that carbon capture and storage has been in the UNFCCC process for quite some time, actually since dating back to 1996. This is 2005 was the IPCC special report on carbon capture and storage. Then in 2006 we had the IPCC guidelines, with the first time included guidance on how CCS, carbon geological storage and transport and geological storage of CO2 needed to be reported by countries in their national inventories. And then in 2011 had agreement of modalities and procedures for CCS under the Clean Development Mechanism. But also Norway, since 1996, was reporting only the vented emissions from Sleipner Vest. So everything that wasn't vented was actually being reported as not emitted. So even before the guidance was there, Norway was reporting CCS as a compliant activity under its Kyoto Protocol obligations. And so one of the things we've heard quite a bit about recently is that direct air capture is not currently included in the inventory guidelines. But I think what this shows us is that there's a lot of flexibility in this process. Because Norway was able to do this before there was any guidance. Similarly, Canada also reported the monitoring activities undertaken at Weyburn. The funny thing about Weyburn is it's an international project, it's a cross-border project, so there was some discussion I didn't know about until recently to actually do joint implementation was an early form of carbon crediting under the Kyoto Protocol. And there was some, until before the US reneged on being in the Kyoto Protocol, there was some discussion about doing a joint implementation project between the US and Canada around the Weyburn Beulah plant. So, this is the sort of quick potted history. So what we did learn also in this period was the acceptance of the technology and the standard setting takes quite a bit of time. I'm not going to go through the details on this chart, but this is something we put together a few years back, and we started around 2005 through to about 2011. This was the sort of timeline for agreeing the inclusion of CCS in the Clean Development Mechanism. And you can see each step of these things, how many meetings were involved, COPs, SBSTA meetings, EB meetings. So there's a lot of work to do to sensitize standard setters, to understand the technology, to have that discourse and have that understanding. And I think we need to go a little bit through that process again on the removals as well. Hopefully, we need to draw, but first thing is we draw on this lessons learned the first time around and we don't try and reinvent the wheel. To say here, CCS and CDM was a long and perhaps forgotten journey that we probably need to remind ourselves of every now and then. I mean, one of the saddest things for me is we spent all that time and effort and then nothing happened for the last 10 years. So, we've hardly talked about CCS inside the UNFCCC circuit since that time. There's a number of reasons why that's the case. So, 2007-8 was the global financial crisis. Then we had Copenhagen COP15, which really was a sort of the real low point of climate action politically worldwide. That was 2009. By about 2010, we saw the carbon price collapse under the EU ETS and also the CDM. And then the European Union, with its quantitative and qualitative restrictions in 2012, basically shut the door on accepting CDM credits from 2012 onwards. So that was really why we never saw much action under the CCS modalities and procedures. So we got the agreement, we had the standard, and then we had no interest in projects because the price in the market wasn't really there. What we also see is the existing crediting standards like ACR does have a methodology today for doing CCS, and now they're just looking at expanding it for BECS and DACs. And again, Alberta also has an offset methodology specific to Alberta, but in both cases they're geographically restricted, so they can only be applied in the US and Canada. And the reason for that is because they rely on the local laws and regulations to back up the storage regulatory side. So, but we need to unlock the potential of markets. This is again is a sort of global MAC curve for CCS, a marginal abatement cost curve that we put together some time ago now, but it's the only MAC curve I'm aware of for CCS worldwide. And what we see actually is interesting is this on the left, the MAC curve is by sector, and on the right it's by region. And so here, there's quite a bit of potential in the region, 50 to 60 million tons of CO2 that's under $20 a ton. And when we see the distribution of that, see quite a lot of it. A big wedge here is actually in this part of the world, in the ASEAN region. This is gas processing, gas sweetening plants that are really an early opportunity for doing CCS today. And well, we built this MAC curve 11 years ago, and I think it's pretty still much relevant. So we've had 11 years of venting this CO2 without doing anything about it. And I suspect we'll just face a lot of questions. Oh, we should have been doing it anyway, and it's not additional, but if we carry on sort of scratching ahead about it, we're not going to get on and do anything about it. So we do need to sort of think about these things in a bit more of a rational sense. One thing to note, trying to fill the gap, is on Tuesday we launched the IETA high-level criteria for geostorage. What this is trying to do is create some basic guiding principles for how standards could be set for CCS activities on carbon removals and any activities that rely on geostorage. And so the idea there is to try and open up the discussion about what do we learn from the CDM days, how does it fit to the Paris Agreement days, what can we do to facilitate deployment. So encourage you all to go away and have a look at those, and feel free to come back to me with any questions. And that's probably where I'll leave it. Hopefully that's given us a bit of a flavour and a bit of some ideas for the discussion that we've got ahead, and I'll sort of like to hand over to my panelists for a bit more discussion. I'm going to go to Amit first, please, Amit, because I know you at GCC have been doing quite a bit of work in this area to develop a new standard for CO2 capture and storage and CCS. So, Amit, the floor is yours, please, to tell us a little bit about your work.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Paul. So what I will do is I will just try to give a little bit of process-related information on by what time and when would the new methodology be expected and the process. And then we'll move into giving an update on the methodology itself, the key elements and the challenges that we have faced so far, and then probably there should be some good discussions on this. Okay, I think you all know, as Paul also told you, about the high-level criteria that has been set. I think this is extremely important because there are 3 standards as of now, and they are limited. And the approaches are also different, so there is a need for some minimum criteria, some minimum guidance, so as to have standardization. Okay, now with regard to the methodology, we have developed this methodology together with carbon counts. Paul is working also on this together with us. So in terms of the team, we have people from the math panel who used to run the math panel, but also a lot of math panel members who have the technical expertise, but also they have been doing it day in and day out. Okay, then in terms of the methodology, the draft methodology is ready with placeholders and options. I'm going to explain why placeholders and options, because it is a tricky subject a little bit, and there are various issues that need to be addressed. Following this, we expect by December, we will send it to the steering committee to have a look at it and give us an initial green go-ahead. Once we do this, we will have an expert consultation of the practitioners on the CCS, so as to revalidate the options that are provided in the draft methodology. So in terms of how we invite experts would be wider, experts from the field who are either working on the CCS but have expertise on this. And then once we finish this, we will open a public consultation. The public consultation would involve all members for a month's time. So anyone, any stakeholder from civil society or from NGO or from anyone has a right to comment during that particular period. And finally, we will go back with those comments and try to analyze them and take it again with the options to the steering committee with an expectation to approve or have a final form by around May, I would say April, May. So this is the timeline for the methodology development. Now I would like to talk about the key elements of this methodology. I think the first thing as we talk about methodology is the applicability, which is that what kind of technologies or measures would be covered, and how do we limit it. So so far we have looked at all, in the pure CCS, obviously, there could be fossil fuel-based CCS, and then power plant CCS or direct air capture, EOR. Initially, one of the options is whether or not to keep EOR as an option, whether to include it at this point in time, because the type of the measures and technologies define the baseline, and each of the technology will have a different baseline, which will also be dependent on whether or not they are operating currently or they are a new build-up. So I think these are the options that are there in the methodology. I cannot disclose at this point in time what will happen, because still the stakeholder consultation is not done, and I cannot prejudge anything at this point in time. Because it's also a little sensitive subject in terms of to what extent, what kind of options should be allowed at this point in time. So I think stakeholder input is extremely important to see the views and balance the views of all the stakeholders involved, and then try to move ahead in this direction. Now, also the challenges is whether or not the project should be limited to one country or a multi-country, because the storage area can be anywhere, in the geographical area, between 2 countries or between multiple countries within international waters, and how these will be dealt. There could be also issues with regard to the legal ownership, who owns what, and how this is determined, the port space ownership as well, because you just have the ownership of land, but what is below the land is normally the right of the government. So I think there are these challenges that have to be really looked at. I think the ownership issue is the key thing. In my understanding, it should be based on government approvals, perhaps licenses. So which will mean that there would be some degree of government involvement. There would be EIA that will be conducted. They have to look at the environmental aspects. They have to look at environmental impacts that will have the management plan in case there's an accident. I think it's a typical content of an EIA to look at the accidents in case accidents happen. What is the management plan that is being proposed and how sound is that, and then so on and so forth. Also, in terms of additionality, I think there are some technologies where additionality may not be a concern, like maybe direct air capture. There is no incentive to, kind of, going that. So therefore, the concern on additionality should not be there. But I think the question is, what would be the price at which the investor would like to go and invest in this technology? Because this is a kind of a key thing. And also, some jurisdictions have tax or some special schemes, like US, you have 45Q, which gives, an incentive. But whether or not that incentive is enough so as to trigger the development of the CCS is something which has to be looked at. I was just discussing today with, I think, Paul Kennedy. So he was giving an indication of about $80 for the pure CCS. I think it's coming from some McKinsey report or so, and 180 under the the Emission Reduction Act for the US that was quite recently announced. So I think these are the challenges in terms of the additionality, but also EOR. Whether EOR is a business as usual or not is a challenge to determine, first of all. And the issue of the common practice is very important in this case because it has been done quite. So I think these are really the challenges. I talked about the transboundary projects, which is also the challenge. But I think lastly, I would like to talk about the crediting period. Crediting period, it's linked with, I would say, the permanence and liability, because these are the key things, that has to be looked at. Now, whenever there is a geographical site and there is a reversal, there could be, in my understanding, 3 types of liabilities. One is the project developer, which is a liability because of the environmental damages caused, for example, which in my understanding should be limited to the project owner who is operator or the operator of the site. Then there is a liability in case the credits are already issued, but some damage happens. And how those environmental attributes or those credits can be, the integrity of this will be ensured. And then also there is an issue with regard, because this geographical site has to be monitored over a long period of time, even after the project is closed, so I see whether or not there is a reversal. So in this sense, I think this also causes a lot of challenge, and therefore there is another political risk which I see is the letter of authorization under the Article 6. Right now, under the negotiations, what I have heard is that under Article 6, there are some countries who are looking at possibility to have whether the letter of authorization once issued can be reversed back or not. So this poses a big political risk and uncertainty to the businesses, also to the standards, but and then how this will be managed. So what we're thinking initially is perhaps also looking at trying to balance the carbon price that's needed to make investments happen, but also try to balance the risk due to the political uncertainty of the letter of authorization, but also because of the nature of the CCS itself. So in that sense, I think we're looking at the possibility to have a buffer to cover those risks. I think there are options that we have put in the methodology, and I think it will be discussed in the steering committee, but also with the stakeholders in a broader way. I think lastly, I would like to talk about the CDM. Paul already explained in CDM, for 10 years, nothing happened, no methodology was submitted, no projects are submitted. The main reason for this is that the CDM methodology required countries or project owners to establish laws on CCS in the country. Now it makes it makes this a barrier, because the countries have to plan and countries have to look at this. It's a new technology. Not everybody has expertise. I'm keeping my mic a little far away, right? Okay, yeah. So. So in that sense, I would say I think this is the barrier. The approach we have taken is that we have developed annexes which will provide the technical information that a project owner has to comply with, so as to ensure the integrity of the geographical site, but also looking at the ownership issues and broader issues on environmental integrity, excellence, and so on and so forth. Because if we only look at the development of a regulation in that country, I think it might be a barrier again. It might end up, I mean, we might be sitting for the next 10 years and we might be discussing on and on and on. So that's it. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Amit. I think we got a strong flavour of the complexities involved, and also why CDM debate took so long, and there were so many steps along that journey and different SBs and discussions. But David, you're also, can I ask you to comment a little bit about how Sea Capsule and the ideas thinking there about the standards you're working on in terms of carbon removals and the methodologies aspects there, and if I could ask you to make a few brief comments.
It's a pleasure, Paul. If I look at the headline, how to ignite the deployment of these technologies, let's establish a framework. We are in a perception business, number one. Number two, we are in a very capital-intense business when we want to deploy these new technologies. So our focus was to create an environment where he who can help early helps twice. And if I look at any contract today being signed to sell environmental attributes derived from a removal project, there is always an assumption what type of standard you're going to contract under, but nobody can name it yet. So we felt at Carbon Finance Lab, supporting our parent organization and our project company 1.5, that one of our tasks is to separate removals from reductions and avoidance, because we are a different class of product with a different price. Currently, the existing standards are offering methodologies and approvals to both. So when and I mean, my past history, sadly, it's a very long one in carbon. In 2016, I had projects where I developed 2 different attributes from a same project. For some of our megawatt hours, we created carbon credits. Some of them we created IREX. And I noticed how much more flexibility I had and how much faster we received revenue from utilizing IREX when we were selling. So we reached out to the company who was behind this standard, and we said, can you create something for removals? It's an engineered process, much more measurables, multiple data points. It's a very different animal to verify it, validate it, and issue it. And luckily the answer was yes. And also one thing we really felt important for this high quality product, that it should be a very transparent process. Where the governance is very different. If I look at the existing standards, which are great and they deliver a very important purpose, and I think all will have space in this market, but to have one where the issuance, the code management, everything is done in a more transparent way than in the current standards, where it's under one umbrella or under one house, I think companies will appreciate it. And when I look at the IREC pathway, in many countries, over 40 countries, is being considered to be a model for compliance tools. And I truly believe in long-term carbon markets, voluntary or compliance markets, going to wash together. They're not going to be the same. I don't see how with all these NDCs and so on. So I think we felt that this could be an interesting way to create compliance options. And last but not least, a lot of the standards are, when trying to manage a lot of the risks, they are creating these buffer pools. And buffer pools are not very user-friendly for a project as this, and also not very efficient, and make the financing of a removal project very complicated. We feel that an insurance product, it's very timely to replace that. And once a carbon instrument is going to be responsible for Treasury, they will understand it much better than dealing with buffer pools. This is not forestry. And that's why we choose this C capsule. And, but we also participate in a VERA program because we feel that's the most robust standard today. And we're also looking forward to open up dialogue with GCC and so on. But C capsule, I think it could be a shining example how to do that. The other is C capsule only going to issue units for removals. The other challenge we have on the market, if I look at the pinnacle of removals, which I would call direct air capture for going straight for sequestration, it's a single revenue source model. If I look at the early pioneers, how much they were selling, some of those credits in low volume were sold for $1,000 plus, or multiple of hundreds. That is very, very costly today. We need to have an approach of a removal portfolio where we are going to offer removal solutions from with multiple durabilities and different technologies. And you know, recently everybody spoke about what happened with Twitter. And when Mr. Musk showed up with the kitchen sink in that office, I said, he is stealing our thunder because we need the kitchen sink to deal with our problem. And we believe in this portfolio should be direct air capture, but should be biochar, various technologies should be dedicated one portion to the global south, because those companies who are trying to create very important work, and you pointed out that this is a global problem, not just the OECD members' problem. We need those projects, and there having project finance is even more complicated. So I think it's really important that we jumpstart an entire sector, not just one single technology. And if I mix these technologies, the unit price drops, makes it more affordable, and perhaps our company would not have the whole pizza pie, but I think the slice we would gain this way is bigger than a pizza pie we could create just with direct air capture. So we really want to empower this industry. And we felt that C capsule as a new upcoming standard with a robust history and a robust infrastructure which is doing thousands and thousands of transactions a day. It's a very good example to utilize, and hopefully it can change how the other standards are looking at some of the elements. So we may be a little bit provocative here, but that's what we feel we need, because we need all the help. And it has to be collaborative. We're not competing with other technologies. We need every single technology. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, I'd like to, so what I've heard now is we spent 6 or 7 years negotiating a text under the UN framework, a political agreement with quite a lot of technical parts to it. We left it to fester for 10 years, and now we're coming back and talking about a whole new set of standards and saying, I need. So tell me, Alfredo, you're in the business of raising money and finance for banks. What do banks make of that kind of surety and certainty in the marketplace? Are they ready to sign off billion-dollar deals for CCS and tech removals on the back of that sort of background?
Well, thanks, Paul, for the easy question. And so, well, I think it is clear that the answer is no. At this point, it is very hard to think that these projects would be bankable with the level of uncertainties that we have, starting from the frameworks, right? We're still developing methodologies. We're still talking about addressing technical concerns that for most of us are not necessarily a concern, but we know that we need to address them, like permanence. Okay, so how do we translate that risk perception from a bank into a palatable thing, right? So that's a challenge for us to get to a point where we may take one of these projects to a financial institution, international cooperation agency, multilateral development bank, or standard commercial bank that will be eventually interested in investing and getting a quick approval. And also, we know that a lot of those institutions are a little more advanced in terms of climate financing. They understand the risk. There's several other potential investors, like, I don't know, you may think of some climate funds out there, or a big tech money that is available for supporting this kind of developments. But I think the key is that how do we get to a point that those projects are bankable, that we can actually bring private equity money, that we can bring commercial money into play, right? So one of the ways that I think we could achieve that is through voluntary markets, right? Is that we already have a framework, an infrastructure in place that allow transfer of capital between different markets, right? We've done that in the past since the Kyoto days, investing new technologies and new things that are not necessarily palatable for a financial institution to invest on. So I think we have that financial framework to allow the transfer of capital flows. So as long as we address the methodological issue, that we have enough and strong frameworks in place that address those technical concerns. And I think David had a great point regarding buffers are not going to solve the issue associated with this kind of projects. We need to think about some sort of insurance instruments, right? It might be a little bit riskier at the beginning, but once the projects start to demonstrate effectiveness, I think the perception of risk will lower, then the cost of an insurance product will go down. So that's one of the things. The other thing that I think it is critical is that on the top of the framework thing, having the methodology, strong MRV, addressing permanence concerns, is what about the sustainability aspects? What about the public perception of having a facility like that next to my house or in my neighborhood? It's the same thing that having a nuclear power plant. But people don't know what CCS is about. So I think there's also a perception thing that needs to be addressed. And you guys have that included in the criteria developed by IETA. I think it's a critical thing. Education of communities, the education of the government entities that are going to be involved in approving the projects, and even on the financial institutions that eventually will have to do a due diligence of those projects. What are the critical aspects they have to look at, right? So if we think of using voluntary markets for eventually giving a boost or a head start on financing these projects, I think it would be very instrumental. And we were discussing a little bit today that a price of carbon might be an issue. Okay, the cost that we have today, the price that we have today, we will never be able to finance a project like that only by selling carbon credits. But I've been talking to many big buyers, major corporations, that and what they tell me, some of them in the hard-to-abate sectors, or energy companies, cement companies, but also big tech companies, they already have in their balance sheets as an internal cost of mitigation or abatement. Some of them tell me between $100 and $300 per ton. And some of them are even more aggressive. They're talking about $300 to $600 a ton. But looking forward, not today, it's for 2030, 2025. So they know that at a certain point that the only way they're going to be able to meet their targets is going to be to go through projects like this. And the cost of mitigation is higher. So you need to think of credits at that level, right? So I think we might be able to find companies interested in signing long-term offtake agreements to support some of these projects. And once you have 1, 2 projects like this, that you start to have the proper insurance instruments, and you start to demonstrate that your cash flows have long-term revenues associated with the offtake agreements, and you have the main risks addressed, financial players will look into those projects in a different way. So I think they become easily bankable. And I think, as David was saying, we're talking about engineered solutions. So once it's working, it demonstrate effectiveness, I think it is easier. It's easier to measure. It's easier to demonstrate that you're actually generating the assets, right? So I think that's how I envision as a natural path. It is very hard to think of public money as well, right? Public money could be a great thing. 45Q in the US is a great instrument to help finance some of these projects because it offsets part of your cost through an incentive. I don't know if Paul is going to talk a little bit about it, but it is also a great, if we can have a similar initiatives throughout the globe. So yeah, that's the only way I see we could get to a point to have bankable projects, is if we have a head start eventually through voluntary carbon markets and offtake agreements with big buyers that already have in their provisions for future years internal cost of abatement around the $300 per ton.
Thanks, Alfredo. I mean, but I think part of the challenge is actually that as I showed on my MAC curve, there's a wide spread of costs, and people don't think about that. Everyone thinks expensive, complex, challenging, but in fact, we need to sort of maybe look a bit more also at some of the more early opportunity type. We've been talking about these early opportunities for 20 years. And I'm not sure, can we still call them early opportunities after 20 years? I don't know. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned from doing those at a demonstration level, lower the cost and build confidence in the technology. I mean, I think Sleipner was a good example, the CCS project in the North Sea in Norway. But let me turn to Paul, given where the discussion's gone. I'm feeling quite negative and down. Can you lift us up a bit, Paul, from a technology vendor perspective? How does carbon engineering make sense of all this, and how do you get up and go to work every day thinking that there's a long-term business for you? I think there is. I mean, the IPCC gives us a line of sight, but it'd be interesting to hear that.
Thanks, Paul, for making me feel good. Yeah, it's funny, as I was listening to each of the folks on the panel, I sort of feel like we're, as an industry, building the boat as we start to sail. And so maybe I'll just give you a bit of context. So Carbon Engineering is a climate technology company from Canada focused on direct air capture of CO2 to sequestration and to sustainable fuels. We've been working since 2009 to refine and prepare our technology for commercial deployment, to support progressive climate policy around the world, and to find and work with partners to deploy this critical piece of climate technology that we need to get to net zero. And as folks have said, removals are quite different from emissions reductions. And when I think about some of what the folks on the panel have said, it's really, we need all of this to make this work. So our job is to take out technology risk. We have fantastic project partners. We're actually in the process of deploying with our partner 1.5 in the US, our first commercial scale plant at 500,000 tons per year for the initial capacity, soon to be a megaton, or we expect it to grow to a megaton. And when we look at that, what do we need to address? We need to address technical risk. That's our job as the technology provider. We work very hard every day to both bring the cost down and make sure that the projects are successful. We have market risk, which comes back to some of the things that Alfredo was talking about. The standards help a lot on that front too, because it gives our customer base and the off-takers confidence that what they're getting is going to have real climate value. The nice thing for us, of course, additionality is straightforward. As my colleague Adam likes to say, why else would somebody build a giant machine that sucks in air and puts CO2 under the ground? So the additionality part is not an issue. But having the standards is critical. Having creating environments where we have bankable projects. For us, one of the real priorities is that security of market. Like, where are the policies that allow us to create that bankable revenue stack that people can take and to the project finance world. I think one of the other things that we haven't really talked about here yet, but that's really important, and particularly important here in Asia, is that linking of markets. So how do we have a situation where we develop projects where it makes the most sense, and be able to satisfy decarbonization requirements in places where maybe these technologies would be harder to implement or not be implementable at all. And those market linkages are a really important part. Article 6, of course, the work that everybody's working so hard on, really important part of that. But making sure that the policies that we're creating allow us to continue to build this sailboat while we get out on the water. So I'm really encouraged by everything I've seen this week. And it's funny, Paul, because this is the first job I've ever had where I have no problem getting up in the morning, because we're going to make this work. Our partners at 1.5 are in the process of making it work for plant number 1. And I think it's a really exciting ride. We need, as Paul said in the beginning, we need gigatons of removals and by 2050. And we really need to remember that if we want gigatons of removals at lower levelized cost of abatement, you've got to start today. I think a lot of people feel like they're going to turn around in 2040 and flick on a switch and all these DAC plants will just start operating. But that's not how these things work, right? These are big projects, and it's important for us to get them deployed, to get the cost down, to get everything sorted. So, we're early innings of this, but we're working really hard with lots of great partners and lots of standard setters and all these folks to make this work.
Thanks very much, Paul. I mean, you certainly lifted up the debate there, because I think we're going in a bit of a negative direction. So it's great to hear that you're making such good progress. And I guess part of that is because of the strength of the policy framework in the US as well. And maybe on that note, it's good opportunity to turn to Michael, who's been involved in that area quite a bit, but also just sort of reflecting a bit on the way the conversation's gone, Michael. How do we sort of wrap these projects together from a legal standpoint? What are the building blocks of a solid project, bankable project from your perspective? It's great to hear your views on that.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. I'm seeing some nodding. So first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michael Drybelbis. I'm here from Los Angeles, California. I've been practicing there at Latham & Watkins for about 10 years. So Latham & Watkins, we're a global law firm. I practice in the energy transition space in particular, many dozens of attorneys in the US, as well as London, the Middle East, Asia. We are a global law firm. We've done hundreds of environmental commodities transactions over the past 20 years, and more recently, we've become a leader in CCS as well. So we have advised on about 25 deals, 25 CCS transactions, have been rated as, by deal count, the #1 firm for CCS in the world. So we're very proud of that. So Paul, what I'll talk about a little bit is kind of what I'm seeing, what we're seeing in terms of CCS transactions that are going on now, primarily but not exclusively in the U.S. About 2/3 of the projects in the world right now are in North America, but we are also seeing activity in the Middle East and of course Asia as well. So what makes a good project, right? So who is doing CCS projects right now, and sort of how are they getting those projects off the ground? You've heard a little bit about the 45Q. The short answer is everyone's doing the 45Q, right? That is driving the structuring of projects in the US in terms of how they're thinking this is going to get it off the ground. It's the 45Q, right? And we're starting to see other jurisdictions look to the 45Q as a model for their own sort of governmental program. Sure, yeah, and that's a tax credit program. So it's a little bit different in that it is a tax credit that will reduce tax liability if you have tax liability. So that's briefly a 45Q. We're also seeing in the U.S. Low carbon fuel standard credits, right? ethanol projects, fuel producers, specifically ethanol projects, are using low carbon fuel standard credits to get their projects off the ground as a revenue source for the projects, right? If you're not familiar with low carbon fuel standard credits, it's very similar to VCM credit, with the exception that it is a compliance credit. These are state and provincial compliance markets, primarily California and British Columbia, where Paul hails from, where that we see, driving projects, right? And so those are carbon intensity credits based on a life cycle analysis, well to wheel, of the credits that are of the fuel that's being brought to market in terms of GHG emissions, right? So those are driving projects really for ethanol projects, right? For the VCM, it's DACs, right? So DAC projects are being driven, and we talked a little bit about offtake agreements for VCM carbon credits, right? So what David was talking about, the uncertainty around the standards and eligibility and sort of the nascent phase of the VCM, those ethanol plants or those traditional industrial CCS projects are not touching the VCM, right? But there's so much excitement and interest in the DAC projects, right, that not only are parties willing to pay a higher price for those credits, but they're willing to contract around and close over significant uncertainty in eligibility standards, right? We're seeing buyers take risk that you just wouldn't see in even more well-developed programs like a low-carbon fuel standard. So that's so what are the implications of this? This sort of like DAC focus on the VCM and everybody else not so much. One, I think, is that project developers of industrial CCS in particular are leaving money on the table, right? Because they're not taking VCM credits into consideration when they're sort of, building the model for their transaction. And so we're seeing the contractual allocation around carbon credits, VCM credits, are not as robust as around allocation of 45Q value or LCFS value, right? So that's, and the flip side of that is the VCM not yet, and again, it's very early, right, at these standards, is not really yet driving those projects other than DAC projects, right? So we're hoping, we would like to see that as ACR, Vera, others are moving forward with their standards, that they'll develop that certainty that the market needs to go beyond these charismatic DAC projects to other projects as well. So why is that, right? So why are the DAC projects the ones that are doing that? Another point is ESG, right? An interesting point, as we all know, most of the large oil and gas companies in the world and many others have made ambitious targets, robust public targets around ESG goals, right? There are established frameworks for reporting towards your ESG targets, right? So, for example, the WRI protocol, the GHG protocol, and the WRI protocol does not allow, generally speaking, right, does not allow the same project activity to result in a reportable Scope 1 emissions reduction, while also generating a carbon credit to sell that reduction to a third party, right? So you can't claim that you've reduced your Scope 1 emissions and then sell a credit to somebody else to make a similar claim, right? So in the context of CCS projects, right, particularly with oil and gas companies, we're seeing that maybe they just opt to keep that reduction from CCS in their value chain, right? And just count it towards their Scope 1 target, right? So it's interesting to see is that going to stay that way, or are there ways that we can bring the VCM to those projects? Which raises a question, then the last thing I want to cover, stacking, right? So if you talk about, large oil and gas company that wants to both achieve its target, its emissions reduction target for 2050, right? They also want to comply with their California low carbon fuel standard obligation, right? So they're going to do a CCS project, which is both going to reduce the carbon intensity of the gasoline that they sell in California, and it's also going to count towards their Scope 1 target. And no one has a problem with that, right? But when you take that same reduction activity and you say that instead of doing a Scope 1 reduction, you're going to issue a carbon credit for it, all of a sudden people say, hold up, what about double counting, right? How can you do a low carbon fuel standard credit and also a voluntary market carbon credit, right, a removal credit for the same activity? That's double counting, right? We don't see that, and we don't see that explicitly stated, for example, in the new ACR methodologies. So another point as we think about expanding these markets is clarity around stacking. what activities are stackable, what credits you can issue across programs. Again, 45Q, no ambiguity. We know we can do 45Q and VCM. So that's another thing we like to see as well. So I guess for Asia, it would be, clarity around eligibility. We didn't really touch on recapture risk or leakage risk, but that's another point. And then finally, clarity around the stacking rules as well.
Thanks, Michael. It's really interesting what's going on in the US there, and really some quite sort of cutting-edge thinking is having to go in about how we stack all this up, counter things together, and make this business model all fit together. And I think it's great that so many lessons are coming out of that. Just for the audience's benefit, it's worth noting that I think that I've seen some crazy numbers on the low-carbon fuel standard prices. They're like $200 a ton. I don't know if that's a real price or if it's come down a bit, has it? Yeah.
It was a real price.
But for those in the Asia Pacific region, for example, this direct air capture credits can be generated anywhere in the world and sold into the low carbon fuel standard in California. So there is that international eligibility. I just wonder, should we throw it out to the floor for a quick round of see if there's any questions? I'll take 2 or 3 questions if there's any, or if not, then I'll throw out back to the panel to see if they want to make some other further points. So is there any questions in the audience? And anything, clarification? Diego, please. I have to run around with the microphone. Yeah. Can you put your hand up, Diego, a second? So he knows where he's delivering the mic.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Theo Hopkins. I'm head of climate change at Petronas. I have 2 questions. The first one is for Amit. What's the difference between the methodology you are developing from the methodology used by the American carbon? Is there any difference, any significant improvement or change? And my other question was, what will make a private company buy, well, this is for everyone, what will make a private company buy a CCS credit if they could buy an MBS credit, which is way lower and represents the same ton of CO2? But Michael said that most buyers assume that risk. How you made these CCS credits attractive to those buyers? What was the rationale behind it?
Is there any more questions? We'll take 2 or 3 if there's any more out there, and then we'll try and answer them in the round. Or no, anyone? Oh, one more here then, please.
Steve Kelly with 1.5 International. Just it's a question for Michael, really, just to expand on your comments on stackability of LCFS and VCM credits. Just, yeah, I'm not sure I completely followed what you were saying on that, whether it can be done, whether it's something that should be done, and what mechanism you see for making that work.
Okay, well, Amit, I think you and I have had this discussion, Amit, about where we are in terms of lining up standards and methodologies, and I think just to make the point that we're trying pretty hard to do that, and one of the advantages of the IETA exercise we've been through is to get everybody on the same page in terms of where the standard wants to be and on what we want to see in those methodologies, and I think we have a pretty good working relationship going on there between the different standard setters to try and make sure we're all aligned. So, I mean, Amit, do you want to add anything on that point, or no? And then your second point was about the attractiveness. Michael, I think that was aimed. I think, Michael, you may be on the spotlight here if you want to sort of try and take those couple of questions.
Yeah, I was saying the advantage of going last, I guess, fresh in mind. But so I think the first question was regarding why would you invest in a CCS credit, DAC credit, if there are other credits available in the market? I think the market has indicated a preference for DAC projects, right? There's a sense from the SBTI and others that carbon removals are necessary to prioritize above and beyond abilited emissions, both because of the need to reverse the effects of climate change and concern about additionality, permanence, other sorts of risks as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important to appreciate that only removals can address legacy emissions. And therefore, as I said in the beginning, you really have to distinguish removals from avoidance and reductions. If you claim a net zero objective, you are married to removals. You cannot do it without them. And then even when you look at removals, the durability of the type of removal you're dealing with is very, very important. 25 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. Maybe you pay a much higher price for a higher value, but that durability you receive assures that you don't have to repeat the transaction later on. And therefore, I think it's really important that Paul indicated, and it's really, we can have to salute California's leadership on the LCFS, that they allowed that if you create a DAC plant anywhere on the planet, it brings eligibility to bring it into this market. And we have our Japanese friends and maybe South Korean friends in our audience, which are very important countries, and they will need to deal with this. I do really hope that then they create their system, they can follow this leadership, because this is very clear, especially when Japan is going to be now running the presidency of the G7 and so on. I think maybe it's something that's worth to consider. Thank you.
My answer would be let's go towards compliance markets, because they tend to be a bit more agnostic. You know, we're not catering to customer demands, and we're catering to the science. We're following the science, not following our hearts a bit more. So, but that's maybe I'm a bit old school in that respect. But that certainly is it, because I see one of the challenges would be, for example, again, go back to the MAC curve, follow the science, because there's some low-cost opportunities out there. If we don't do those, yet we're doing direct air capture, well, it's a bit crazy, huh? We're emitting 60 million tons of pure CO2 today, and then we're trying to capture it back out at like 0.3% or whatever it is, 0.4%, 0.004% in air. So we need to get a little bit of rationality into this debate as well. But Alfredo, you want to come in there?
Yeah, something that I want to add also is that typically the companies or people buying these kind of credits would be on the same supply chain, on the same industry, on the same sector. That's one of the things. The other thing is that once countries start to include and accept this kind of removal projects into their NDCs and turn that into obligation and bring it to compliance, then you don't have a choice. So I think it is a matter of first a willingness to abate in your sector, in your supply chain, in your area of influence, and the other one is by mandate or by the need to use that to comply with your country NDCs. And
I guess maybe just one more thing on that. I think some buyers today are using the voluntary market as foreshadowing of what's coming in compliance markets, kind of following on from what you've just said, right? So Airbus earlier this year bought 400,000 tons of permanent removals from 1.5, and you know they can see the Corsia regulations coming that will require these, you know, high durability, you know, really high quality credits. And so I think, you know, the voluntary market is great for sort of seeding demand and getting people interested and knowledgeable. Of course, you know, we spent a lot of time educating people on even what DAC is and what sequestration means and all those sorts of things. But what we really need if we want to have a long-term industry develop is we need those voluntary markets to migrate into compliance markets, so that gets us to bankable projects. It gets everybody having clear sight to what standards should be applied and all those sorts of things. So I think it's really, as we see the compliance markets coming, that's also driving some of this behavior. And a purchase like that, the Airbus one, is also a good financial move, right? It's much less expensive form of abatement than some of the other alternatives they have.
Can I just have a comment?
We're a bit out of time, but if you have a quick comment, quick reflection, and then I'll wrap it.
I think just it's two very interesting comments. The reference to that Airbus transaction, that time when the transaction took place, that was 500% of the total transacted removals volume when it happened. And when Paul made a reference about this new plant which is emerging in Texas, That is 100 times the size of currently of the largest removal facility in the world. So these are very important milestones. We are in a beginning of this journey. Thanks.
Okay, so I was just also thinking about what came to my mind is that once a methodology is developed and approved, we still need to apply for CORSIA approval. So the process of the tab is that it is a material change. It'll take somewhere another 6 to 8 months, in my understanding. And then we have VCMI, and so I mean, I think those can also be the timeline that have to be considered while looking at this whole thing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, folks. I mean, that was an interesting discussion. I think we went up, down, and ran roundabout, but I'm feeling sort of pretty positive. So thanks for everyone, and thanks for everyone online who hopefully it was an informative session. And just let me join in, give my fellow panelists a big hand. Thanks.
Recording stopped.